Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. August 18th, 1966. Phuoc Toi Province, South Vietnam. 6 Australians lay belly down in wet leaf litter, faces smeared with red clay and sweat, watching a force so large it didn't feel real. Through a screen of jungle vines and rubber tree trunks, more than 600 Viet Cong fighters were gathering in the open below them, talking, cooking, laughing softly, stacking ammunition, checking mortars, completely unaware that they were already dead men walking. And here's the part that sounds impossible. In the next 14 minutes, that entire concentration would be smashed so hard it would take months to recover. But the 6 Australians wouldn't fire a single shot. No heroic charge, no cinematic last stand, no spray of tracer fire, just silence, patience, and a radio. The air was thick enough to bite, 95 degrees, humidity so heavy it turned every breath into warm water. Your lungs didn't feel like they were filling. They felt like they were swallowing. Sweat didn't evaporate. It just accumulated, soaked fabric, and made everything cling, shirt to spine, webbing to ribs, straps to shoulders. Even the jungle smelled tired. Hot sap, rotting leaves, gun oil, and that faint metallic tang that always seemed to hang around men who knew they might have to kill today. At Nui Dat, the Australian base was waking up in the gray-blue haze before dawn. Generators thumped, radios crackled. Someone somewhere cursed at a stubborn engine. But away from the noise, in the shade beside a canvas tent, 6 men from 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment did what they always did before stepping into the green. They checked their gear one more time, and then again, because superstition lives comfortably inside disciplined soldiers. Rifles were wiped down, magazines were pressed and reseated. Fuses on claymores were felt with fingertips, like a man checking the pulse of something dangerous. Grenades were counted without looking because you didn't want to look nervous. You wanted to look bored. Bored meant you'd done this before. Bored meant you'd survive. Their patrol commander was a sergeant with the kind of calm that comes from older wars. Malaya had taught him things you couldn't learn on a firing range. Borneo had taught him that the jungle doesn't care how brave you are. It only cares how quiet you can be. He didn't give speeches. He didn't slap shoulders. He simply unfolded a map, ran a dirty finger along a line of hills to the east, and tapped a grid square as if he were pointing at a snake in tall grass. Intelligence said 2 big enemy formations, D445 Battalion and the 275 Regiment, were massing somewhere out there. 600, maybe 800. Main force, not local guerrillas, mortars, recoilless rifles, men who'd been fighting since the French days, men who knew how to make a jungle trail into a slaughterhouse. If those numbers hit the Australian task force all at once, in the wrong place, it could be a catastrophe. The Australians had about 4,500 men in the province, but spread thin across bases, patrol areas, villages, roads. Concentration was strength, and the Viet Cong knew it. That's why they gathered, and that's why these 6 men were going out again. They weren't fresh, not even close. They'd been in the bush for 2 straight weeks already, moving through jungle that turned daylight into twilight beneath the canopy. Trees packed tight enough that sometimes you had to rotate your shoulders sideways just to squeeze between trunks. Vines hung down like curtains in a ruined theater. The ground shifted from red clay that grabbed at your boots to a mattress of rotting leaves that made footsteps quiet, but treacherous. One careless step could send you sliding, and one sliding man can make enough noise to get 6 men killed. The sergeant looked at his patrol, 5 pairs of eyes that didn't need encouragement. They were SAS qualified. That meant they'd already been broken down and rebuilt by training that was designed to see what was left when comfort, sleep, and certainty were stripped away. It meant they could move like hunters instead of soldiers. It meant they could stay still for hours without scratching a mosquito bite, because the price of scratching might be death. Each man carried an SLR or an M16, spare magazines stuffed everywhere, grenades bouncing softly against webbing, claymores strapped tight, the weight pressed into shoulders already bruised from constant load. But weight also meant options. Options meant control. Control meant survival. Out there, the enemy weren't farmers with rifles. Not anymore. Those days were gone. These were experienced fighters, hardened by years, confident in their territory. They owned the trails. They owned the night. They could set an ambush you wouldn't see until it was too late, and they could vanish into tunnel networks that could swallow whole platoons of search and destroy troops. The Americans fought the jungle like it was an equation. Insert large units, move fast, force contact, count bodies, declare progress. They sent 30 men, 50 men, sometimes companies crashing through the bush like a storm. But storms are loud. A Viet Cong sentry could hear an American patrol from a kilometer away, branches snapping, gear clinking, radio squawking. By the time the Americans arrived, the enemy had already melted into the greenery like smoke. The Australians had learned something different. In the jungle, the side that sees first wins, the side that hears first wins, the side that shoots first wins, and the side that's invisible decides when the fight happens. Late afternoon, August 17th, the same 6-man patrol entered a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat. The French had planted the trees in neat, unnatural rows decades earlier, and the plantation felt wrong after days in primary jungle. Too orderly, too open, like a room with the furniture removed. The ground was easier to move across, but openness can be dangerous too. In open ground, there's less to hide behind. You're either quiet and unseen, or you're dead. The point man froze, not slowly, not dramatically, just stopped, as if his body had turned to stone. He raised a clenched fist. passed. The signal. Every man behind him locked into stillness instantly. 6 humans becoming 6 shadows. The point man lowered himself and stared at the dirt on the trail. Footprints. Fresh, not boots, sandals. The Viet Cong made them from old tire rubber. The treads were faint, but there were lots of them. Dozens, crossing the path both directions. The edges of the impressions were still damp and crumbling, not hours old, minutes. The sergeant crawled up beside the point man and studied the sign the way a butcher studies a cut of meat. His brain ran calculations that didn't involve numbers as much as instincts, distance, direction, speed, weight. Intelligence said the enemy mass was 4 kilometers out. These tracks said the enemy was here, close enough that the patrol might already be inside the outer skin of the beast. This was the moment where aggressive instincts whisper in your ear, call it in now, hit them now, set an ambush and kill the next group that walks past, make the enemy pay. But the sergeant didn't choose the satisfying option. He chose the dangerous one. He chose to follow. Because dozens of fresh tracks don't mean a dozen men. They mean flow. They mean movement towards something bigger. They mean a river of soldiers feeding into a lake. And if you find the lake, if you find the exact place 600 men are sleeping, eating, stacking ammunition, then you don't need to shoot them yourself. You just need to mark them. The patrol began to move again, slower now, as if the air itself might snap like a twig. They followed the tracks deeper into the plantation and back into thick jungle. The sun sank. The jungle darkened. Night arrived without ceremony, like someone closing a door. For 14 hours, from late afternoon into the next morning, the 6 men moved like ghosts. Stop, listen, watch, move 50 meters, stop again. The jungle made constant noise. Chirps, clicks, distant calls, leaves shifting. But a trained ear learns what belongs and what doesn't. A bird call that repeats too perfectly. A sudden silence where there should be insects. A faint smell of smoke where no village should be. The tiny wrong details that tell you another human is nearby. Leeches found them. They always did. You felt the little pinch, then the warm trickle, then the urge to tear your skin open with your fingernails. You didn't. You just let the leech drink because sudden movement is louder than you think. Mosquitoes crawled into ears, into eyes. Sweat ran down cheekbones and gathered at the jaw until it dropped. You didn't wipe it. You let it fall. They moved less than 2 kilometers all night. Less than a mile. To anyone who hadn't learned jungle warfare the hard way, that would sound ridiculous. A waste. A patrol should cover ground. But covering ground fast gets you found. And if you get found by 600 men, you don't get a heroic death. You just disappear. Every 30 minutes, the sergeant whispered into his radio, low enough that the men beside him could barely hear. Grid coordinates, direction of movement, estimated numbers. Back at Nui Dat, someone with a pencil marked those whispers onto a map, watching the patrol crawl deeper into enemy territory like a slow-moving needle approaching a bomb. Near dawn, the jungle ahead changed. Not visually, jungle always looks like jungle, but in the way it sounded. You could hear voices now, not close, but present, and you could smell it. Rice cooking, tobacco smoke, that oily smell of many weapons in one place. They crawled forward using shadows and trunks and settled into cover about 150 meters from the enemy assembly area. And there it was, a space maybe 400 meters across, packed with men, 600 Viet Cong, maybe more. They were preparing for something, the posture of an army before it moves, cleaning weapons, checking packs, rolling up mosquito nets, heating rice. They had mortars, recoilless rifles, boxes of ammunition stacked in piles that looked, to the trained eye, like a mistake waiting to explode. The patrol could have opened fire. From that distance, with surprise, they could have cut down 20, maybe 30 men before the enemy reacted. Grenades could have added more. It would have been a story that sounded good in a report. It would have been a victory. It would also have been suicide, because the moment they fired, 600 men would scatter into the jungle, vanish, and then turn the whole world into a hunt for 6 Australians. The patrol would be chased, cut off, shredded. The sergeant didn't let that happen. He forced his men to swallow the instinct to fight. He made them do the hardest thing in war, watch. They counted heads the best they could, they marked positions, they noted where the sentries were and how lazy they looked. The Viet Cong felt safe. They were watching for helicopters, for big patrols, for armored vehicles. They weren't watching for 6 men who had become part of the dirt. The math was brutal, 6 versus 600, 1 against 100. But this wasn't going to be a straight fight, because the patrol had something the enemy didn't fear enough, artillery. The sergeant measured distances on his map. Nui Dat's guns were within range. The 105mm howitzers could reach this plantation easily, less than 3 kilometers. Close work. He checked his watch, 6:45 a.m. He lifted the radio handset, swallowed the dryness in his throat, and whispered the words that change everything. Fire mission. Somewhere behind them, miles away in the base, men who had been half awake snapped to life like a switch had been thrown. Guns crews moved before the transmission even ended. They'd been waiting for exactly this. Scouts don't crawl for days to find nothing. 4 105mm howitzers sat like crouched beasts, already oriented, already fed shells like teeth. 6-man crews worked each gun, trained into muscle memory. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. At 6:47, the first ranging round left the barrel with a deep chest thump sound, less a bang than a heavy punch. The shell climbed, spinning, faster than sound, invisible above the trees. The 6 scouts didn't move. They watched the enemy camp below, men eating breakfast, men laughing, men believing the morning belonged to them. At 6:49, the ranging shell landed short, about 50 meters. The explosion cracked the air, kicked up dirt, and for a heartbeat, the camp froze in confusion. The sergeant spoke into the radio like he was correcting a mistake on a chalkboard. Add 50. Then after a breath that felt like it took a lifetime time. Fire for effect. Fire for effect means the testing stops. It means you stop tapping and start smashing. At 6:51, the artillery commander replied, "Shut out." 4 shells were in the air. At 6:52, the jungle erupted. The first full volley landed almost simultaneously in the center of the assembly area, and the sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. Pressure slapped the chest, ears popped, the ground jumped. Rubber trees that had stood for decades were sliced into splinters, and men were turned into fragments so fast their bodies couldn't understand what happened. And then the guns didn't stop. A shell every 15 seconds from each gun. 4 guns. A storm of steel arriving every few seconds, walking back and forth across the plantation like an invisible giant hammer. From 6:53 to 7:06, 13 minutes, the plantation became a place the human brain wasn't built to process. High explosive rounds slammed into earth and flesh. Tree bursts detonated in the canopy and sprayed shrapnel straight down like metal rain. White phosphorus marker rounds blossomed into burning clouds that stuck to anything living and refused to go out. Men ran and the fire followed because the sergeant adjusted the fall of shot with calm corrections while lying in the dirt like a man directing thunder. Left 10, drop 50, add 20. The Viet Cong tried to scatter. Instinct screams at you to run when the sky starts killing people, but running in a grid of artillery is like running inside a closing fist. Every direction became wrong. Every tree trunk became a death sentence when it exploded into wooden spears. Then the secondary explosions started. The Viet Cong had stacked ammunition together. Mortar rounds, RPG warheads, rifle cartridges, because concentration feels efficient when you're relaxed. Under artillery, concentration is suicide. When the shells hit those stockpiles, the plantation flashed with explosions that were even bigger than the howitzer's work. Mortar rounds cooked off in rapid succession, pop 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 like demonic firecrackers. Crates of small arms ammunition ignited and thousands of rounds began to cook off, bullets firing themselves in every direction, turning the air into a crackling, insane hive of noise. The sounds layered until they became one continuous roar. The crump of artillery impacts, the ripping scream of shrapnel, the whoosh of secondaries, the crackle of burning ammo, the brief human screaming that cut off mid-note. Smoke rose above the jungle canopy in a column of gray and black you could see from kilometers away. Birds exploded from the trees in panicked flocks. Animals fled. Even the jungle for a moment seemed to recoil. At Nui Dat, soldiers stopped what they were doing and stared east at that rising smoke, feeling the earth tremble faintly beneath their boots and wondering what could possibly be happening out there to make the world shake like that. At 7:06, the sergeant whispered one last word into the radio. Ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The plantation fell silent in a different way, like the silence after a door slams in an empty house. Not even birds called. The air was full of dust and cordite and that bitter chemical smell that clings to explosions. Small fires burned where phosphorus had landed. Trees that were still standing were stripped bare, white wood pointing upward like bones. The 6 Australians did not advance to check the bodies. That's what men do in stories. In real jungle warfare, walking into the kill zone is how you die. Even if most of the enemy are dead or wounded, survivors are still armed, still terrified, still capable of dragging themselves behind a stump and firing at the first silhouette they see. 6 men walking forward would be stepping into a field of desperate bullets and hidden rage. Instead, they did what they'd been trained to do. They melted away, slowly, carefully, backward through the same jungle they'd crawled through to get here. They laid claymores behind them as insurance, not because they expected pursuit. What sane man pursues the ghosts that call down the sky? But because war punishes arrogance. Hours later, they reached a landing zone where helicopters could snatch them out before the enemy could reorganize. The rotors would thunder, the jungle would briefly remember noise, and then the 6 men would be gone, leaving only smoke and wreckage behind. In the days that followed, intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations pieced together what those 14 minutes had done. The numbers varied depending on who counted and who survived to talk, but the scale was undeniable. Hundreds killed and wounded, an entire massed force shattered in one morning. D445 Battalion, one of the units meant to spearhead attacks in the province, was knocked out of action for weeks. The 275 Regiment pulled back to rebuild. Its confidence cracked. The planned assault on Nui Dat never came. It died in the rubber plantation. Australian casualties from the strike itself, 0. 6 men walked in, 6 men walked out. Captured Viet Cong later described it in the only language that fit, hell falling from the sky. Some said the jungle attacked them. Some said they never even saw an enemy, just heard a single explosion, then the world ended. And that was the real weapon the Australians used. Not the shells, not the guns. Fear, because fear changes behavior. After that morning, Viet Cong units became reluctant to gather in big numbers in areas where they suspected Australian patrols operated. They moved more at night, they spread out. They relied more heavily on tunnels and covered positions. They became quieter, more careful, because the idea of invisible men watching from 50 meters away, unseen, and then calmly bringing down annihilation, that idea sticks in your mind. In the Australian area of operations, the method hardened into doctrine. Small patrols moving slow, watching longer than they walked, calling in overwhelming firepower only when the target was worth it. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't create dramatic footage for the evening news. It created results. But not everyone learned the lesson. Many American units stayed locked to their own doctrine. Find the enemy, close with the enemy, destroy the enemy with direct fire. move fast, make contact, generate numbers. Body count, weapons captured, villages searched. To them, spending 2 weeks to move 2 kilometers sounded like incompetence. Watching instead of fighting looked passive, even cowardly. The cultural gap was too wide. Australians hunted, Americans pursued, and in thick jungle, hunting tends to beat pursuing.